our session is the Global Health Supply Chain Maturity Model. So my background, I spent the bulk of my career at a Toyota manufacturing facility. So I very much approach supply chain through the lens of people and process and viewing the supply chain as an end-to-end system and how to optimize for total system improvement, not an individual component that could lead to sub-optimization. And at Toyota, the focus was on improving quality, reducing waste, reducing costs to make more money, to make Toyota more money. And that's not all that different from the public health supply chain. We want to improve quality, we want to reduce cost, we want to improve throughput, but not to make money, but to save lives. And I know on the panel this morning, there was a quote that was made by one of the panel members, and that was, "We don't want patients turned away on my watch." So that's really the focus of our supply chain, is how can we ensure that we have the commodities necessary to save lives and improve the lives of women and families in your communities. So by show of hands, how many folks are here representing a country? Very good. And if we could just have the country, someone from one of the countries mention who's here. So I know we have Senegal is here. We have Nigeria that's here. Mozambique, Kenya, South Africa. Very good. Welcome. And then we have a number of partners as well that are here. So I appreciate everyone's attendance. So we're going to move pretty quick through this presentation because the real value is going to be the group activities that we have with the maturity models that we have posted in the room. So I don't stand up here as the expert. Oh, that's fine. Sure. I don't stand up here as the expert in maturity models, but as a member of the community that's working together to drive continuous improvement and continuous learning. So I look at the faces out here in the crowd and have had a number of conversations regarding maturity model. So I may open it up to some of those experts so you don't just have to listen to me today. But the concept of maturity models in the private sector, does anyone want to give a one-sentence introduction on how maturity models are used in the private sector? Roger would like to mention.
Codified continuous improvement.
Very good. So the concept of maturity model is how can you do a diagnostic, how can you do assessment to understand what aspects of your supply chain that you need to improve upon. It's very much an audit-based process that rolls up to an aggregated score across your supply chain components. And you're ranked on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most mature. Level 5 in the private sector maturity models are your Gartner top 25 supply chains. Those are your Amazons, your P&Gs, your Toyotas that are in that number 5 range. But for public health supply chains, due to the markets in which we operate, so very low on a traditional maturity model curve. So this community has worked on creating and adapting maturity models for the public health space. So show of hands, how many people have used assessment models like the NSCA, the EVM, 360-degree assessments? So show of hands. So many folks have used the tool, developed the tools. The tool that we're going to review today is not a tool that is seeking to replace those tools, but to be another tool in the toolbox. The focus of our maturity model is one of rapid diagnostics. So for example, the NSCAs and the EVM, you may complete those once a year or once every 2 years. So those are on, a multi-annual cycle. Our maturity model could be done in an hour. And we're hoping that we can complete the maturity model in this one session. So ours really fills the gap of being a rapid assessment that you can do in an hour, identify where you should improve your supply chain, and repeat. So Herschel from P&G today talked a lot about PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, and this is a tool that can really facilitate that. So the goal, has anyone read the book, The Goal? Show of hands. We have had a few folks. Gavin, I'm sure, has read it. He's chuckling. So The Goal really talks about the theory of constraints. And kind of the key points for our maturity model is there's a relationship between the maturity of the supply chain and the performance of the supply chain. So the more mature you get, the higher levels of performance that you're able to obtain, and your performance measures mature over time as well. So at low levels of maturity, you're focusing on visibility, you're beginning to focus on availability. But as you get more mature, you're going to start focusing on efficiency, cost measures, inventory turns. And two, the theory of constraints from the goal. So the theory of constraints is that every process, and we'll say in the supply chain, has a constraint. And that constraint limits your throughput, your total system throughput. And the goal, if you've read it, is a fictional story that uses a Boy Scout troop to teach the theory of constraints. So this is Herbie. So we're introducing Herbie, the Boy Scout that can transform your supply chain. So in the book, it kind of talks about this Boy Scout troop, and their goal is to reach their destination by sunset. So that's the goal. Our goal would be 100% product availability. And they need to be there by 4 p.m. So Herbie is the slowest kid in the troop. So he's not able to walk as fast. So he, in this example, is the constraint or the bottleneck. So as they start out on their journey, the faster kids up front start to distance themselves from Herbie. So those are the aspects of your supply chain that are have higher levels of performance. But if you remember, theory of constraints is your throughput is limited by your constraint. So the system throughput right now is dictated by Herbie. So even though these boys are out front, the system itself does not have higher throughput. So soon, all the boys pass Herbie, and Herbie can't even barely see the troop ahead of him. So then the troop says, we've got a problem. We need to address this constraint. So they say, Herbie, how about you lead our troop? So instead of you being in the back and getting past, how about you set our pace? So Herbie sets the pace, and they walk much slower. They're just now truly being able to identify what their true throughput is because Herbie is leading that. So through continuous improvement, through continuous learning, they realize that Herbie's backpack is full of food and camp, and it's causing him to be very slow. So they distribute his various components across the boys, and he still sets the pace because he's the constraint, but they're able to move much faster, and they're able to achieve their goal by focusing on their constraint. So transitioning now to viewing the supply chain as an ecosystem. So I started out the presentation talking about at Toyota and at many leading supply chain companies, you need to focus on your supply chain as a system. We heard that a lot through the sessions this morning, is focus on your supply chain as an end-to-end system, as an ecosystem. We've heard a lot of those terms. So our maturity model is proposing that these 20 components represent the critical few supply chain components that are really driving and impacting performance. And sustainable and performance only increases when you manage the supply chain as an ecosystem. And once again, the least mature area of the supply chain pulls down the overall system. So whichever one of your components here is your Herbie, that's the one that's limiting your supply chain. So this summary here is showing the tool broken down by its components. So once again, we have a critical few supply chain components that are the inputs that are driving your supply chain performance or your outputs. Our model, as you can see printed up here on the wall, is a series of yes-no questions by component. So there's about 20 components. You have yes-no questions to establish what is your maturity level for each component. Our maturity levels, instead of 1 through 5, we're showing them in more of a metal form. So you start out having a canvas supply chain, then you progress to a bronze supply chain, then a silver supply chain, then the gold metal supply chain, and then a graduated supply chain. And some of the key characteristics of each of those metals would be, for canvas, you're focusing on basic capabilities at a canvas level. And your availability is probably less than 60% for your various commodities. Bronze is basic visibility. You have some visibility, but really no process control. Silver, you have full visibility. and your availability is generally 85 to 95% available, and you're now, your basic processes are working. Then you move to gold, and you begin working on those efficiency measures, and you have greater than 95% availability. And we would say that's a consistently functional supply chain. And then once you hit the green level, you're at what we call graduated, where at that point the government is beginning to take on all aspects of the supply chain, and you're graduating from needing a lot of heavy donor support. Now, the graduation that we're showing here, if you applied that graduated metal to the Amazon, Toyota, P&G maturity model, you would be probably at about a 2 to 3. The other dynamic of our maturity model is that many of these components are impacted by the market in which your supply chain sits. So your market, you could be impacted by your technical market, your access to labor, your access to professionals, your access to outsourced service providers. So the market in which you sit is also a unique aspect of this maturity model. And then fourth is the potential value. So we really see a lot of value in this maturity model. One, it can be a framework for investment so that it can be influencing projects that are created based on these components here, including donor coordination. So complete your maturity model. Influence this project can be a communication tool between governments, implementers, and the donor community. And lastly, and most important, is country ownership. This tool, the spirit of this tool, is one of the governments using the tool and completing the tools for themselves, not needing a consultant, not needing a implementer to come in and do the diagnostic, but the countries own this tool, the countries own these results, and ultimately can drive improvements within their own supply chain. So it's government owned and government administered. So this here, not expecting anyone to be able to read that. We're not doing an eye test today, but this here is just a summary of what you see printed out here, and we'll interact with this here in a moment. The output, as you can see, is right next to it here. This is an Excel-based tool, and you select yes, no across the components, and your output then is where is your maturity level for each of those components. And the key point for this model is your maturity is not determined by an aggregated score across all these dimensions. Your maturity level is dictated by whichever one of these is your least mature or your constraint. So for example, in this example, your lowest levels of maturity are transportation and facility level order management and facility level visibility. So those would be three components that you would really want to focus on, do root cause analysis, and understand what projects can be funded to improve your constraint. Then you follow up with the next constraint until you start improving each of these components. And what we're proposing is that investments in components that are already more mature are not going to increase your throughput at all. If you think about Herbie, you're just getting the boys that are faster further down the trail. So we're proposing that you would have greater throughput if you focused on your least mature supply chain components. Also, you'll see the red lines that are on this map here. And these red lines dictate constraints that are on the supply chain from the market. So for example, let's say in financial management, the market is constraining your ability to ever get past this low bronze level. Maybe it's access to cash. Maybe it's access to some financial measure. But you're not going to ever improve past this market constraint unless you make a market level investment. And you can move this market constraint further out into this range here so that you can then become more mature at a micro level. The other key point of our maturity model is you'll see the critical few components that are inside this black box. There are two that are outside of that black box. And those are the percent of your supply chain that's funded internally and the percent of your staffing that's funded. So maturity from canvas to gold is not dictated whether you can finance 100% of your supply chain. That only comes into play when you come at this accredited level, when you really start to take on more of the financial burden of the supply chain. So your performance, your maturity is going to be dictated by your components. So next step. So I'm Herbie and I'm constraining your supply chain. So your Herbie, we're proposing, is going to be one of these components here that you'll identify by using the model. So find your Herbie at the van workshop. We're going to go into an activity today to do that. If you don't get complete, we can continue to work on it over the next few days. So the next steps, going quickly so we can get to the activity, is we're going to divide up ideally by geography. So I know that we only have 3 different printouts here. So we may have to have some geographies. Anna's going to get some more. Thank you, Anna. If we can have the Kenya team on one, the Nigeria team on one, the Senegal team on one, and so on, so that you can all dialogue about your supply chain and complete this diagnostic for your specific supply chain. And for donors, for implementers, for private sector folks, just kind of join the conversation as well. And then what you can do is you can use this output to inform your van roadmap. So starting tomorrow, we're going to really get into what we're calling our jumpstart sessions to really understand where are your constraints, and then you'll work to identify a plan to improve. You'll have a roadmap for improvement. So you can use this output throughout the rest of these 2 days to influence your van roadmap. And lastly, I'm not an expert. No one's an expert in this room. That's why there's a beauty in the community that we have here. So let's learn from each other. Please provide us feedback on the model. This is a living tool that we're going to iterate on, that we're going to improve, that's going to be really used as a public good that will grow and change as the supply chains grow and change. So with that, I'll stop and ask if there's any quick questions, any clarifying questions before we start our activity. Yes, Trip.
Real quick, you talked yes, no for all those, but how do you set the market constraint? Is it just subjective, or is there?
Yeah, very good question, Trip. So the market aspects are really kind of the next step for us. So really the 2 next steps for this tool is how do we bring in those performance elements? So how do we bring in the visibility, the availability, the efficiency measures into a performance management tool? And then secondly, how do we start defining some of these market constraints? And we're working with the experts at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others within the community to really understand markets and how to address those markets. In the back.
Yeah, you said Amazon and P&G and I don't know the third one. Toyota have 5 score and public health is 0 and 1. What are the main differences?
David, I'm sure, has a more articulate answer.
And I think in terms of the analysis, when we were doing this analysis and testing the tool and getting some country teams and getting some country partners to actually do this work and to try and score this, actually Senegal scored quite high. South Africa scored quite high. So there are examples. One of the challenges, and I know you live this every day, and this was the story I said to Bill and Melinda when we presented this, was that Senegal is a good example of us buying the shelf initially. And what I meant was that we bought the capability because we had IntraHealth, we had Merck for Mothers that supported us to work with partners to move the dial in terms of availability and visibility. And that was done through a project that we funded with Merck for Mothers, obviously that IntraHealth implemented. Now, what you're doing now in Senegal is really interesting because you're shifting this now to a government-owned and government-funded model. So it might be in the short term as you go for a few, 20 family planning products to 150 essential medicines, that some of that performance might get lost because it's more complicated. But actually, in terms of your maturity, you're actually doing better. So I think, Mike set himself up to say that it's not that everybody's at 0. There are some examples within the partners that we're working with. South Africa, again, I think would rank more highly. Some of the projects that we funded as donors, but our challenge as donors and the challenge that Senegal is doing a nice job to address is actually to not just buy the shelf by hiring an NGO or hiring an outsourced provider, but to also institutionalize that within the government system. And they are still choosing to work with IntraHealth and work with the 3PLs as well. But I just wanted to say that. And then Roddy, but we had a question here in French first. And then
Euh, Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais comprendre. Nous avons dans la chaîne d'approvisionnement le modèle que nous utilisons pour évaluer la performance, c'est notamment sur les indicateurs d'alerte gaz, qui sont au nombre de 12. Maintenant, j'essaie de classer le modèle maturité en essayant de comprendre il intervient à quel niveau. Est-ce que... je continue? Non, parce que c'est difficile. Ah, ah, vous avez oublié. Je reprends. Hein. Mais je n'ai pas fini. Non, parce que c'est difficile de mettre une pause. OK. Excuse me. OK. Donc, ce que je voulais dire pour résumer, c'est ceci. Je comprends qu'il y a un outil pour évaluer la capacité de la chaîne d'approvisionnement. Il existe également les outils notamment fournis par l'OMS et les autres qui permettent d'évaluer la performance de la chaîne d'approvisionnement. Donc je parle ici de capacité, d'une part, et d'autre part de la performance. Donc,
all right. To summarize what I wanted to ask, first, I think that there are tools that allow you to assess the capacity, and there are other tools that allow you to assess performance, like tools from the WHO, etc. It's not finished, sorry.
Donc, la question que je voudrais poser, c'est, je comprends que ce modèle permet de mesurer la capacité de la chaîne d'approvisionnement. Maintenant, la question, c'est à quel moment est-ce qu'il faut le faire? C'est annuellement? C'est à quel rythme? Est-ce que c'est utilisé après avoir constaté que la chaîne d'approvisionnement n'est pas performante? C'est ça ce que j'aimerais comprendre pour lier les deux outils.
All right. So I understand that this model allows you to measure capacity. Now, my question is, when should it be done? With which frequency? Is it annually, etc., or is it going to be used only when there is no performance?
So I'll attempt to answer, but I'll also ask some colleagues in the house to answer. So how many people have done an EVM assessment? And how many weeks did it take us? Usually it's a team of multiple people from outside, from WHO, from in the country, and it takes multiple weeks to undertake. It's a very effective, very detailed, goes into a lot of detail at multiple levels, and has a very important role both for Gavi, for for countries to understand their cold chain equipment. This tool, in comparison, is not looking to replace that because the EVM is a very detailed, effective tool. What this tool does is, with a little bit of coaching, your own team can undertake this tool and do it to, when you get back home to Kinshasa, they can actually have the first attempt at doing it within an hour or two. And so I'm going to call on Kaduna, who have actually done this, maybe just to verify that this is the case. Yeah?
I think when Deborah was trying to apply this tool to see where we were in Kaduna, it was surprising what she came out with, which reflected exactly the reality on the ground, because it was just going through all those questions and based on what has been happening. And when she gave us the final report, it exactly showed where we were. So that for us was very, very helpful because we knew where we were and we could then set ourselves where we want to go. So it was a very useful exercise. And it took actually less than half an hour. I think it was about half an hour to just answer those questions one by one. And if you're involved in the process yourself, then you know what is going on. And if you are honest with yourself again, it will just give you what you put in it. So for us, that was really helpful.
Can I make a comment? Quickly, please, yes. Companies that use these maturity models like SAB Miller, DuPont, Procter & Gamble tend to measure capabilities, not capacity. That's an important point. And the second point is low levels of maturity are normally associated with improvement projects that are disconnected. You don't know whether you're moving the problem just from one part of the business to another part of the business.
Yes, good point. So last comment I'll make, and then we'll get into the model. And just reiterate David's great point and Pam's point as well, is that this is a government-owned tool, so frequency for completing would be as often as you needed to complete that PDCA cycle, that plan, do, check, act. And you can do it, let's use Nigeria as an example. All the states in Nigeria can complete this model themselves to get a diagnostic of their state supply chain. And at the national level, they could do one as well to get a full country perspective as well. So the tool is very flexible. It can be used by states, by teams, for different verticals. So HIV, family planning, essential medicines, you can use them for all of your verticals. And it just takes less than 2 hours to complete for each. And the last point I'll make is a quote that really kind of sums up how I approach things. Is sometimes folks, if you're looking at this low maturity, and let's say you're a Canvas supply chain, not to have any negative feelings about that, but really feel empowered by that. And the quote is that every current condition, every current state was once a future state. So there was work that had to be done in the past to get you where you are today. So celebrate that, feel empowered by that, but continue to be on that continuous improvement, continuous learning journey so that you continue to improve and mature in your supply chain. So with that, I'll want to get to the valuable aspect of the exercise.